metrics, you have to think about what are you measuring? What are you trying to measure and why? And so a lot of the time, folks will get caught up in looking at a number of nice-to-have metrics, and we want to really focus, instead of on quantity, we want to focus on quality metrics that are actually going to help drive your business. So when you think about metrics, first and foremost is, does your organization have standard metrics? Are those standard metrics actually enabling you to meet your business goals? Are they metrics that are still being utilized by the organization? Should they be revisited? How many metrics do you have? You want to pare it down to some reasonable metrics that are actionable. So if there's a change coming also, be proactive. Think about what metrics you might be needing to manage any of those changes. Are you changing to different practices or business units? Do you need different reporting or different metrics established for those business units if you have a new growing business unit, something of that nature? These are all things to keep in mind when you're thinking about your business and how you want to measure it. I think it's good to revisit those metrics at least annually, just to make sure, as well as with your reporting. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but just to make sure they're actually usable. And there's a lot of time what happens is folks will replicate reporting that they're currently doing, and also they'll replicate the metrics used in that reporting. Whether that's when they change to a new system or just something they've always had. And it may be a report that someone's looking at, but it's not being used to drive anything. And those can tend to, if there's a lot of that can tend to cloud and overshadow what's truly important and what you truly need. So when you're thinking through metrics, think through what do you want to measure, how do you want to measure it, and who your end users are. What are they trying to consume by this, and what can they do with it? Okay. Reporting considerations, and this is what I just mentioned a little bit, is who's going to consume the information. Do you have multiple audiences? For example, your project managers are going to be real focused on their own projects and their own project profitability, whereas a management team might be focused on an entire business unit or entire practice that they manage. From a departmental standpoint, department heads are usually very focused on overall department metrics like utilization metrics for their department. Whereas an individual contributor is more concerned with what is their utilization. So it really is audience dependent, and you can make sure that you can reuse some of those reports and just change subtotaling. And as long as you define kind of standard metrics, you want everyone kind of utilizing those. So how they consume it, how you present that information will become important based on who your audience is. Okay. How frequently are your metrics reviewed, and when should they be reviewed? For example, when you're looking at metrics like timesheet compliance or your revenue, you want to look at, a lot of the time, timesheet compliance is going to be weekly. Look at daily timesheet compliance, because most often your organization is going to submit timesheets on a weekly basis. So it's really very organizationally dependent, but you want to make sure that you understand the processes within your organization. So when you're reviewing the metrics, they're actually valid and valuable to you. Okay, a big thing from an OpenAir standpoint, and any system really standpoint, is how is your system configured? Is it capturing information at the level, A, is it capturing the information, and B, is it capturing it at the level in which you're trying to use it? So if you need, departmental utilization, but you don't have your users tagged to a department, it's going to be really challenging to get that information in easily used format. You'll end up doing a lot of filtering and reporting and so forth. When if you just did an initial setup of tagging resources to departments, you could pull a report, with departmental subtotals. So that's definitely a consideration we always look at. Managing changes to reporting. So if someone's How are you handling report request enhancements or creating new reports? Typically, we suggest that there should be some type of governance model in place and report ownership. So you want to ensure that you're defining what is your timeline for changes to reports. Does everyone need that change, or at least the mass majority? Who's making those changes? As it should typically run through a standardized group, so that you can look at, the timeline when you can expect the change, who you can expect to handle that change, and making sure that it's valid across the organization and continues to drive forward with your business objectives. You definitely want to validate your requirements around reporting and around metrics. And there's a lot of different ways that people can consume information, and there's a lot. OpenAir has some robust reporting, but you want to be careful not to create reports in all different views, because that's how people are used to looking at it. You want a standardized view so everyone can utilize that same benchmark. Someone pulls a report, they're looking at the same information as the person next to them, okay? And from a requirement standpoint, when you think about utilization, for example, utilization can be calculated in a multitude of ways based on your organization. Some folks calculate it based on, here are the hours that we work per year, and it's strictly a billable hours over the hours they work, the hours in your work schedule. So if you have a 37.5-hour work schedule, you have 1950 hours in a year, and it's really your utilization over that base work schedule. Other folks take out holidays because they exclude holidays from their utilization calculation. So when you're thinking through how do you want to look at these metrics, what does that metric truly mean, you have to understand how are you defining that metric. Okay. Okay. So some of the most common project management metrics are, of course, your project margins. A lot of the time an organization will have a standard margin, or at least a margin by business unit that they want to hit. So a lot of services organizations say we want a 35% margin, and that's just kind of a general rule. So when you're looking at your project profitability and your project margin and your margin percentage, you can quickly gauge, okay, here are the projects that are running at these great margins, and here are the projects that are maybe underrunning to that margin percentage. Why is that? You can look at, is that if you have project type set up in your system, is it a certain type of project that's always achieving higher margins? Is it a certain type of project, or maybe a new offering that has lower margins because you're getting to that repeatable model for that offering, which then you can expect to maybe have lower margins than your standard 35% because it's a new offering. There's growth and standardization that needs to happen with that offering. Okay. Delivery efficiency. And this is a metric that's used by some of our customers and across the organizations to look at how are you measuring, what percent of target are you hitting your budget hours versus your actual hours. So it's more of an hours-based metric, but it's project-specific to help you understand, where are you in the scope of the project with respect to what you planned versus what you're actually achieving. Backlog. It's a huge metric for services organizations because that's what's telling you what you have remaining for overall for the organization, for your project, overall for the organization. It allows you to identify any gaps you may have to your overall targets. And allows you to understand if you have enough pipeline to achieve that gap and make your services target for the year, how much pipeline you may need in order to achieve that target, or if you're already looking at overachieving. Okay. And OpenAir looks at backlog from primarily from a budget versus you can look at it from a revenue standpoint or an invoicing standpoint. So it's a budget less actual calculation, and you can look at it from revenue or invoicing. All right. Budget versus actual hours and dollars. And of course, this is also a huge one. You look at your project budgets and how are you tracking to those budgets. Okay, that's huge for project managers to enable them to effectively manage their projects. And it's going to be real dependent on, are you looking, most of the time we have folks that are looking at managing to their revenue budget. You can do this based on, your revenue or your invoicing. If you don't run revenue in OpenAir, you can look at your budget versus actual based on what you've invoiced. So a number of different ways to look at those metrics and understand them. OpenAir allows you to set up, as many of you may know, a lot of the OpenAir system functions based on custom calculations. So really defining that metric and understanding how to set up that calculation so you can get meaningful metrics and meaningful reporting. Project duration. Some folks are not aware, this I know is kind of a big one, around date calculations. Now, these can be used in detailed reports, so they're not, OpenAir doesn't allow the date calculations in summary reports, but you can create a date difference. So if you think about, okay, here's my start date for my project, here's my end date, how long did that project run? You can then go back and decide, are there projects that are definitely, you can also add an estimated close date and measure start from estimated, or the difference between estimated close date and actual close date, to understand what your differential is there, and look at, is it a certain type of project, or is it a certain, is it an implementation project, or is it a lot of our fixed projects that we have a significant difference? What type of projects are driving these differences? Or you look at overall duration, right? You're just looking at how long do our projects last, to give you a frame of reference. Project health. Typically, this is noted on your project properties. A lot of the time, it's a red, yellow, green concept, and you can pull a list of your projects and what their project health is. The red, yellow, green concept, it can be defined, of course, by your organization. It's more of a process concept. So financial risk or scope risk can be red, so on and so forth. You can pull a report that limits it to certain project health statuses. So you're only looking at red because those are the items you need to action on, or yellow, so that before it gets to red, so you make sure that you're managing any potential issues and don't allow it to get to that red stage. Okay. So here's an example of our project margin report, or how a project margin report can be set up. We at TopStep look at our project margin from an invoice standpoint. So what did we invoice and what margin did we get? In order to do this, you need to ensure that you have costs set up. It's one of the baselines, right? Because your invoice minus cost equals your margin, or your revenue minus your cost equals your margin. In OpenAir, you can have 3 levels of cost. A lot of the time, folks will use these 3 levels for different types of costs. So, for example, a management team may want to look at more of a true cost. So they'll have one cost level as a salary plus, deployed non-payroll cost, or just a salary cost. For project managers, they'll use a blended cost rate, either overall across the organization. Most often, this is by role. So they use a blended cost rate by role, and that will allow you to it ensures that you don't have to be concerned with the idea that people can back into salaries. I know that tends to be a concern, back into salaries through a cost rate and look at, and then they're focused on information that's actually not relevant to the project or delivery. So there's different cost rates that can be leveraged. I think this is really good based on your audience if you have concerns about that across the organization. And different reports can be used and shared with these different cost rates for your different audiences. Okay. Also, margin percentage calculation can be used. I find that the percentage is really easy. As I was mentioning earlier, it just helps with a quick look to say, okay, are we achieving our expected margins? Now, This will show you you can use this through the project, or you can, a lot of folks, your true margin percentage will be, at completion of the project. But you can look at this through the project to see how you're tracking against what you expected, either organizational goal or the margin you expected to get on the project. All right. So backlog report, as I was mentioning a little bit earlier, as you'll see, Testis does most everything. This is data from our sandbox that does most everything based on your invoicing, on our invoicing. So our invoicing less our budget is our remaining backlog. Delivery efficiency. This is the percent of target that I was discussing earlier. So it's really just your budget over versus your approved hours to give you what percent of target are you at. Okay. The closer to 100%, the better. If you're over 100%, as you can see here, that tells you you're having an overrun. It's the same concept as, a budget minus actual hours, but and you can look at it a number of different ways. You can look at billable hours. We typically look at it as all hours, because if you have hours that you can't bill, that still indicates that you were over budget. So that's why you'll see that this is using total approved hours by project. All right. Resource management metrics. A huge one for services organizations is utilization. Utilization, as I alluded to earlier, is really, it's organizationally defined. Utilization calculations are custom calculations built in OpenAir, and a number of different utilization metrics. So I know commonly we think about billable utilization, but there's also the concept of a productive utilization. That's typically defined as your billable plus anything that you would consider internally chargeable. So if your organization that allows folks to get utilization credit, maybe towards a bonus for some type of a strategic internal initiative. Some folks allow it for business development, so developing any entrance to a new client. And so you can look at all those different metrics from a utilization standpoint. So billable utilization, productive utilization, which tends to be a big one, and some folks even look at non-billable as a utilization metric versus just hours. So what's your non-billable percentage versus billable and or productive? Okay. So it's a nice way to look at hours and percentages across a number of different utilization categories, and looking at how are you defining this utilization. There's also the opportunity to, instead of just working off of your base work schedule and either keeping or removing holidays, you can also add a target per user in the user record. And the target is, a lot of the times that's defined by role. So if you have a resource or a role that has, project managers have to be 75% billable. Instead of using a work schedule, you can, which is over your total hours, you can look at a percent of target. So how is this resource tracking against their 75% target? And this is often used when you're looking at bonuses. I know a lot of folks get bonused on utilization, so this tends to be the percent of target can be helpful if that's how your organization functions. This is something that needs to be set up in everyone's user record, so you can define utilization rates by person, or you can define them, use it at the role level, but they still need to be uploaded into the system and implemented at a user record level. Okay. You can change an end date, start and end date utilization percentages. So if someone changes role, you can keep that history, end date, if it was 75% because they were a project manager, but they've moved into more of a practice management role, which says, okay, they only have to be billable 40% of the time, you can have a date reference for the initial role and then move forward with the new target. So that's helpful to keep and maintain your history. Margin by resource. So depending on how your system is configured, if margin by resource is something you need, OpenAir definitely has the capability to do that. You need to look at how your billing rules and revenue rules are set up. Keep in mind the margin by resource is much easier to get when you're looking at a time billing rule. For fixed fee, it's dependent on the rule you use. Fixed fee projects, it typically doesn't take into consideration a user. It's an overall fixed fee on the project. There is a way to get this. However, it's not the fixed fee on percent complete rule. It is a different rule, and if that is of interest to anyone, you can always email TopStep or reach out to one of us, and we can help you understand how you would be able to accomplish that. Revenue capacity. The intent of this metric is to show you how much revenue can be driven by a given resource. Okay, that's nice. It's based on a target bill rate, so you can use one of your cost rates in your in one of the 3 cost rates that you can set up by user, and you can change that to be called the target bill rate. And then you can look at user work schedule hours multiplied by this target bill rate to give you a revenue capacity per user. All right, that helps you understand what revenue you anticipate to generate by the users. If you're going to look at, how much more revenue can be generated by a new hire based on when they're hired and so forth. FTE calcs are significant for services organizations. So this is if you have a resource, and that resource, for example, one resource is, instead of your work week is 40 hours, that person is consistently putting in 80 hours, their functioning is 2 FTEs. That tends to be a very helpful metric when you're looking at numbers-backed guidance to request a new hire. You can say, hey, my department is working, at 3 FTEs over the actual number of headcounts. We need to do some hiring. All right. So here are some examples. Your department, this is a department utilization. We have billable and non-billable. So this is who are the resources in these departments, what is their percentage of billable and non-billable utilization. I do apologize, we should have had a percentage, the check mark for the percentage symbol, which is why these are turning out as numbers, those little check boxes in the system that would have made these percentages. But it's a concept, and this is done monthly. You can obviously adjust any time frame or any range you want to see. You can also collapse this so it just shows department or it just shows department user, and you can have projects. So there's a lot of versatility on how you can subtotal and see the information in these reports. Revenue capacity is what I was mentioning also, and this is showing work schedule hours, the target hours, and it's giving you a revenue capacity. As you'll see, some folks don't have a revenue capacity because they didn't have a target bill rate in their user record, which is why it will turn out as 0. So that's definitely a system configuration issue. You need to have that base data in the system in order to run it within the reports. Okay. Financial management metrics. Average bill rate. So average bill rate is basically meant to help you understand what on average are you getting. So if, going back to for, fixed projects, we're getting this average bill rate, or for any given type of project, this is the average bill rate we're getting. Is that above our expectation, below our expectation? And helps you understand if you have, if you have a profitability issue? Is it because of an overrun? Are you looking to get something differently? Do you need to look at your pricing structure, how your pricing deals in order to increase your average bill rate? Okay. Margin by contract type. Again, this is a setup. OpenAir has the capability to have a number of custom fields. So depending on what you want to measure, you ensure, for example, contract type. If you want to know, okay, what's the margin I get on fixed fee deals versus time and material deals, you would want to make sure that you have a custom field set up, drop down preferably, that allows you to pick that contract type within each project on your project properties form. So then you can run a report that will show you margin by contract. All right. And revenue by resource or role. This goes back to looking at what type of revenue generation primarily for T&M billing. Okay, you can look at that. Talked a little bit previously about resource level. You can also pull reports on a role base. So how much revenue are you generating per role? And do you need to, goes back to, do you need to up your billing rates for these roles if you're not achieving what you anticipated? Do you have too many folks in the role? There's a number of different, when you combine the metrics, a number of different business decisions they can provide for you. Right? Financial forecast. This one is a big one. So for a financial forecast, OpenAir uses a concept called charge projections. Those charge projections can be set up on a number of different things. If your organization uses assignments and doesn't do bookings, projections can be generated based on assignments. If your organization uses bookings, it can be generated based on bookings. That tends to be a more granular forecast. Your projections can be set to run automatically. Most folks have it set automatically per night so that the next day, any update they can see, any update they'll be able to see in the morning. You can also generate projections within a project, and that's an internal switch, if you make a change and you need to see what the new forecast looks like. For financial forecast, you need to have at a minimum, your billing rules set up, because what the charge projections do is they take, whether it's assignments or bookings, they use that to run it through the billing rules and give you, your estimated forecast, what you would project if it is that you achieved these bookings or these assignments. Okay. And another option for a financial forecast is something called a straight line. That's set up by project stage. So what that means is you don't have to have billing and revenue rules set up, but a straight line forecast basically takes the days in the month and takes a budget on a project with a start and end date and spreads it evenly across those days in the month and from the beginning and the end time frame. So that is something that can be set up by stage. So if you have a proposal stage, for example, in your system, and you say, okay, here's our opportunities. We aren't going to set up billing and revenue rules on our opportunities because they may not come through, and that's just extra work, or as part of the process, it's just not a necessary step. So you can set up, most of the time this is used for proposals, you can set up a straight line feature so that in the proposal stage, those will use that straight line projections while everything else will leverage your charge projections using either bookings or assignments. Okay. If you want a revenue forecast, there is the option to check on revenue forecast, and you want to have revenue rules in the system so that you can provide revenue projections for your project. So here's our average bill rate report. Pretty easy. Typically, it's going to be your invoices over your billed hours. You can also have an effective bill rate that takes into consideration productive hours, or you can do it over all hours to get that average bill rate. So it really depends on how you want to define that metric. Okay. Financial forecast. As you see, ours is using our billing rules and an average cost, our cost rule and margin. So you can, depending on what you need, we look at everything from, just our billing, or you can just look at your projected revenue. We like to go down to what would, projected margin. You can add a custom calculation to give you a margin percentage, which is helpful because that will give you a forward-looking indicator on, are you going to make your margin percentage as expected. Okay. So OpenAir PSA features. As I mentioned, custom calculations are a pretty significant part of, once you've identified your metrics and you've looked at what are your requirements for these metrics, ensured everyone's on the same page with here's what this truly measures, you can create a custom calculation that will allow you to get that metric, and then that can be used in reporting. Typically, we create a number of the custom calculations in the company-wide view so that they can be used in your company-wide summary report. Okay, just more access to custom calculations. Custom calculations can be a bit tricky, looking at depending on what you're trying to do. So there is definitely some learning around those, but they can be really, really useful in providing you the information exactly as you want to see it and being able to report on that. So they're very useful, and they're used almost every report, every summary report for our customers, especially with respect to variance calculations. Okay. The ability to designate report usage. So OpenAir has a feature so you can just identify, A, report owners, and B, who's going to be using that report. You can use filter sets, you can design, instead of every resource, every user record has a filter set, right, that filters down the permissions they have based on their role. Very often, we create reporting filter sets. So, for example, a project manager typically has access to projects that they're booked to or assigned to and they own. From a reporting standpoint, you may only want your project managers to focus on projects that they own, because they don't have responsibility over the projects that they're booked to or assigned to. So you can create a filter set that just designates project owner, and then when you add that filter set to the report, when a project manager runs the report, they'll only see those projects that they own. This tends to be really useful because it kind of gets rid of all the noise if your project manager is also booked to a number of projects outside of the ones that they own. Okay. Dashboards. OpenAir has the ability for some dashboarding. Now, what I can tell you, and some of you may know already, the dashboard feature, it's not nearly as versatile as an Excel. Okay, so when you think about dashboards, you're going to want to think about higher level information. So utilization. When you're looking at billable hours or anything like that, you want to look at overall a total department and utilization by month, or an overall organization, and you can look at billable hours versus non-billable hours for a given time period. If you have a limited number of folks in a department, you can do a dashboard by person for utilization or something of that nature. But if there are a number of people, you don't want to get too specific in a dashboard because it's not usable. All right. With the dashboards, there are limitations. If you make a change to a report in the dashboard, you need to reload it into that dashboard so it refreshes. There are just certain nuances to the dashboarding. Okay. A lot of the times folks will pull a report out of the system for more complicated dashboarding and do that still in Excel or another tool. Scheduling reports. So OpenAir has the ability to schedule reports, which is a nice feature, so you can push a report out to someone on, whatever given time frame. A lot of the time it can be weekly. Another thing that isn't listed here is your status. So when you look at your reporting that contains your metrics, you look at this. There's a tab called status, and this will tell you how often is this report being run. And the reason that's useful is if a report isn't being run, hasn't been run in 3 to 6 months, that begs the question: is that report still needed? Or is there training needed to ensure that people understand why this report's useful and what they should be using it for? Folders, there's a concept of folders in OpenAir. So this helps you categorize reports. So you can look at it as, a function. If you have specific business units that require specific reporting, you can do it, by business unit, by function, or by audience. It really is very dependent on how your organization functions. But it's very helpful, instead of seeing a giant list of reports, to have folders so you can go specifically to, okay, I want to look at project margin, so I go to my project management folder, or I want to look at utilization, so I go to my resource management folder. It's a little bit easier to consume from an end user standpoint. Tips. So when you think about your metrics and your reporting, you want your reports to focus on core metrics. You want a standard set of reports that people can use to understand, to ensure that they're truly looking at the same information. OpenAir has a lot of robust reporting capability. So the last thing you want is to have a number of different folks creating reports and with all different data that people aren't understanding. It's not consumable, it's not easy to use, and it just doesn't allow people to focus on what they need to focus to meet their business objectives. So, and when you think about metrics, as we've laid out here, you want to think about a limited number of metrics per function, because you want to make sure that you're focused on the right information. Okay, so having 50 metrics is great, but I'm guessing that maybe 10 to 20 at most is going to be actionable, depending on the organization. Okay. Usage, sorry about that, of the reports is what I was mentioning a little bit earlier. That status tab can really help you with understanding how who's using, are the reports being used. Also, who's using them. That goes back to kind of who's my audience. Overall, you want to look at a report governance model. Who owns the reports? Typically, that's a centralized ops team. Who owns the reports? Who's in charge of making enhancements? And what is your maintenance review process? Okay. From an ownership standpoint, one thing to understand is a lot of the time we suggest that if you have an extra user license, you have that as a report owner, because if I own a report and I go in and let's say one day I expand the columns and I only expand them from one project, the next time someone runs that report, because I'm the owner, that's what they'll see. So if all of the columns are collapsed, typically it causes confusion when someone runs it and one project isn't collapsed. I've had that happen. It may sound silly to some folks, but it truly can cause confusion, especially with new starters, people new to the system, or people that just, aren't necessarily all that versed in the reporting piece. Another thing about this report governance model is really training. Also identifying in here who's responsible for training folks on the reports, how are people trained, developing, as you'll see the next line, is a reporting catalog. We suggest this, and we've done this a number of times, to just specify, what does this report mean? What is the meaning for the report? What is the intent? What metrics is it identifying? And giving people some guidance on how do you use that report. So for FTEs, if it says one person's working at 2, what does that mean to me? Okay. This is especially helpful when you have people moving into different roles that may be looking at different new reports, so that they can understand what is the intent of that report, what does it mean to them, as well as new joiners. So when you're onboarding people, it's a helpful guide to say, here's the reports, here's what they mean. And it's not meant to be an extremely lengthy document. It's meant to just give snapshots of each report, what it means, how often it should be used. So as I mentioned earlier, timesheet compliance, that's an easy one. From a timesheet compliance standpoint, if your organization does weekly timesheets and they're due on Monday, approved on Tuesday, you want to look at that timesheet compliance report, depending on who you are, probably on Tuesday after approvals are supposed to be done, to understand, Monday to understand who's still outstanding, Tuesday to understand who hasn't been approving timesheets. Okay. The audience, who is this report meant for? So timesheet compliance isn't meant for the individual contributor. They know if they haven't done their timesheet. But a manager, right? A manager, a project manager, someone who wants to know, okay, why aren't my timesheets in? Is it because someone hasn't submitted them, or is it because, I haven't approved them? For a department lead, where are things getting hung up? That type of thing. So you want to help people as much as you can understand the point of what metrics mean and how reports should be used. Okay. So this is just a little bit more information about TapStep, our website. If you need any help or assistance, please feel free to reach out to us. I know that, especially for folks that are new to the system, even folks who have been on it for a while, if you have any change in your configuration, or if there's anything that you're missing, and you say, gosh, I wish I could get this, it's always helpful to think through, is the system configured to do that? Or why can't I get this metric? How do I get this? Okay. We're, of course, always happy to help. We do reporting workshops, which tends to be really helpful to organizations to just give them an understanding on, the difference in the different types of reports, custom calculations, how they're being used, and really set up some standardized reporting for folks. Okay.